everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of different types of videos relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you know whenever I upload a new video. Today I'm back discussing another semi-unsolved case. So it's one of those cases where someone was convicted, but there's a lot of differing opinions on whether or not it was the correct person that was convicted. So as always, I would love to know your guys' thoughts on the case once you've watched the entire video, so please do leave them down below. I love seeing your guys' discussions. So yes, before we get started, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the case of Ursula Herrmann's death. 10-year-old Ursula Herrmann disappeared on September the 15th in the year of 1981 in Germany. After school on Tuesday the 15th of September, which had been the first day of the brand new school year, Ursula Herrmann had headed home, returning back to her family's house in a place called Esching in South Germany. And I do apologise for any point I mispronounce any of these names or places at any point. She lived at home with her 3 older siblings and her parents. After arriving home, her and her older brother Michael had practiced playing piano together before then leaving her home once again. This time she was headed in the direction of Schondorf, where her afternoon gymnastics lesson was planned to take place. She had chosen to take her bike, and on her journey she travelled through a block of forest that separated the villages, a forest which was a popular area for local runners, bikers, hunters to spend their time. She was known to have biked along a path which travelled next to the Ammersee Lake, and before long she made it to her gymnastics lesson. On this evening, Ursula was known to have been wearing dark green cords with a grey wool cardigan and reddish-brown coloured sandals. A few hours later, after the end of her class, she set out on her bike once again. This time she travelled to her cousin's home to have dinner, as her home was located in Schondorf as well, which was not far from where her gymnastics lesson was. She ate dinner with her relatives, and then at around 7:20 p.m, Ursula's aunt had received a phone call from Ursula's mother saying that she needed to return home before it got too late. So on her bike, it would only take her around 10 minutes to return to her own home, but as it was slowly getting darker outside, her mother wanted her to set off straight away. Ursula told her mother that she was heading home at that very moment, but when 30 minutes had passed and there remained no sign of her daughter at home, Ursula's aunt received another phone call from her mother. And to her mother's surprise, she was informed that Ursula had left their home 25 minutes before, just after she had called the first time. And the two women immediately knew that something wasn't right, as the journey should not have taken Ursula anywhere near that long unless she'd encountered some sort of trouble on her way. Ursula's father immediately set out in the direction of the forest coming from their home in Esching, while her uncle headed to the forest coming from Schondorf in hopes of them both searching through each end of the forest. The pair travelled through the forest and each found no sign of the 10-year-old by the time they'd met in the middle of the path along the lake, all while calling out for Ursula. By the next hour, word had spread of the missing 10-year-old girl, and residents from both villages all set out in search for her with the help of local policemen and firemen. And the authorities had immediately focused their attention to this lake, flashing their torches in the direction of the water in the hopes of seeing something, but ultimately struggling to see with the undergrowth obscuring their vision. By this point, it had started raining heavily and it was growing increasingly darker, with it being nearly midnight. The police had brought in a selection of trained sniffer dogs to aid in their search, and very quickly one had led its handler away from the body of water into the forest itself. And here, around 20 metres from the lakeside path, they came across Ursula's red bike, but no sign of Ursula. The following morning at dawn, the search continued, with even more police officers and residents setting out with the fear for the girl's safety, as at this point they'd known that hours had passed and the discovery of her bike indicated that something sinister may have taken place. They started sifting through the areas of thick forest until they came to the border where the forest met with a private land which was owned by an elite private school called Landheim Schondorf. They had at their aid a helicopter searching from above as well as a police boat and divers all searching the vast lake in the area. 36 hours passed and there remained no sign of the young girl when Ursula's parents had received a phone call at their home. This phone call was extremely unexpected and unusual, as when they answered the phone, there was initially a moment of silence before a short jingle was played down the phone to them, one which they soon identified as being a jingle played to introduce the traffic bulletin on the Bayern 3 radio station. There was another moment of silence before the same jingle was played once again, and then the unknown caller had hung up. A team of local law enforcement were called to the home to report the strange incident over the phone when, over the next few hours, 3 more of the exact same calls were received at the home, this time with a team of authorities being positioned ready to record them. And then the following day, which was Friday the 18th of September at around midday, the local postman had dropped off an envelope at the HERRMANN home, which was addressed specifically to Ursula's father. The envelope had been marked as urgent, and when he'd opened the delivery, he found a ransom note, which was made up of cut-up letters out of newspaper pages. The note read, "We've kidnapped your daughter," all of this written in broken German, followed by, "If you ever want to see your daughter alive again, then pay the 2 million Deutschmarks ransom," which is the equivalent of around £450,000 at the time, I believe. And it was made clear that the kidnappers had expected the letter to have arrived at the HERRMANN home the day prior, so before the unusual phone calls had started, as the note then went on to explain that they would be calling their home and playing a jingle. They told the Herrmanns to respond to the jingle just by saying whether they will or will not be paying the ransom, then going on to say, "If you call the police or do not pay, we will kill your daughter." As there had been no response to the calls placed on the previous day, the kidnappers had once again called the Herrmanns on that Friday, this time with Ursula's mother agreeing down the phone to pay the ransom. She had also asked the caller for proof of her daughter being alive and in their possession, and so she'd asked them a specific question that they would need to ask Ursula for the response to. So she'd asked the kidnappers what were Ursula's nicknames for the 2 stuffed toys that she had, but she'd gotten no response from the other end of the call. And so her mother became panicked and said, "Talk to me, say something from Ursula," but that was the end of the call. Later that same evening, a second letter was sent by the kidnappers which hadn't arrived at the home until the Monday the 21st of September, and this letter had contained extremely precise instructions for the drop of the ransom money. So they wanted the money to be provided to them in used 100 Deutschmark bills and all placed inside of a suitcase. The Herrmanns were then told that Ursula's father must take it to a specific and undisclosed location, and he was to drive there alone in a yellow Fiat 600 car, driving no faster than 90 kilometers an hour on his journey there. And so all of this very specific details, it was very unusual and very unexpected. And in comparison to a lot of the other residents that were living in the area, the Herrmann family were not particularly wealthy. They lived in a lovely house, something that they'd only been able to afford because Ursula's great-grandfather had been the owner of the land. He'd purchased the land some years before. And because of the financial position that the family were in, they hadn't actually been able to come up with the required ransom money in that moment to exchange for the return of their daughter. And because of this, one of the local residents had offered to raise a part of the ransom amount, with the state then committing to pay the rest of it in order for them to be able to get their daughter returned to them. When the money was raised, the Herrmanns continued to wait for more contact from the kidnappers, providing them with the specific location for the money drop, but they heard nothing. 2 weeks passed with no phone calls and no letters, and the police decided that they need to go back and search the nearby forest once again. Over 100 police officers set out with 10 trained sniffer dogs and a plan to divide the woodland area into 4 quarters, and then in each quarter there were smaller grids in order for each law enforcement officer to carry out a thorough search of these little grids. 4 days of searching went by and they'd sifted through nearly all of the forest, this being the 19th day that Ursula Herrmann had been missing. And then at 9:30 a.m. on Sunday the 4th of October 1981, around 800 metres away from the lakeside path, one of the officers out searching had come across something solid underneath a thin layer of soil while he was searching his grid. He shouted out to alert another officer of his discovery, and another did rush over to help him wipe away the soil that was covering whatever it was that he'd found. And it was here they discovered a brown blanket laid on top of a wooden board. When they'd lifted this wooden board, they found another board which looked as though it was the lid to a smallish box which was measuring roughly around 72 centimetres by 60 centimetres. And the lid of this was painted a green colour, and it was secured with 7 sliding bolts locking it in place. One of the officers had forced the lid open using a spade and looked inside, which is where he found the remains of Ursula Herrmann. It was an emotional moment for all of the officers that were part of this discovery, as all of the local residents alike had shared this hope of returning this young girl to her family. 2 law enforcement members immediately set off in the direction of the Herrmann family home in order to inform them of this heartbreaking discovery, while an autopsy was ordered to be carried out on the body. The results of the autopsy determined that she had died between 30 minutes and 5 hours prior to being buried in this box in the woods, and because they found no signs of struggle inside the box, they concluded that she had likely been drugged before being placed inside. And it seemed to the authorities that the kidnappers had every intention of keeping Ursula alive, as inside the box it was actually quite deep into the ground. There had been a shelf with a seat, which also doubled as a toilet, and she was found sat up in this seat. There were 3 bottles of water, 12 cans of Fanta, 6 large chocolate bars, 4 packs of biscuits and 2 packs of chewing gum inside. They also found a small collection of books, 21 in total, including a mix of literature from comic books to romance novels and thrillers. There was a whole variety in this collection. Inside was also a working light, a portable radio that was tuned specifically to the Bayern 3 station, the same radio station which notably the jingle that was played over the phone to the Herrmann couple had been a part of, as well as a ventilation system made of plastic plumbing tubes having been installed. But despite this attempt at giving her plenty of ventilation while inside this box, the kidnappers had not realised that without an actual machine circulating the air around the enclosed space, the oxygen would very quickly run out. It was determined very early on that the authorities were likely looking for more than one perpetrator, this mainly because of the size of the box that they'd found in the woods. It was estimated to weigh around 60 kilograms, and because of the shape it would require at least 2 people to be able to carry it and then bury it. The kidnappers would have had relatively extensive knowledge of the forest area as well, as it was in a very, very remote area of the forest, so they would have been able to locate this area without having raised any suspicion when burying it in the first place, as well as when they took the young girl there. Because of the nature of this case, it was hugely publicised around the local area, and every resident had heard the news of Ursula Herrmann's death. In an attempt to aid their search for the perpetrators, the authorities had posted a 30,000 Deutschmark reward for information leading to the arrest of these kidnappers, and in response, hundreds of tips started flying in. An identity of one individual was mentioned numerous times, and it had been that of 31-year-old Werner Masarek. Masarek, his wife and their 2 children lived just a few hundred metres away from where the Herrmann family were living. Werner Masarek was known to have previously trained as a car mechanic, but at this point in time, he owned his own TV repair business, meaning he had a lot of practical knowledge regarding repairs and to some extent constructing devices. He wasn't a particularly well-liked man in the village and was particularly known for his short temper. It was also soon discovered that he was in a significant amount of debt at the time, so investigators knew that he would have a motive for extorting money. The week after the discovery of Ursula's remains, Masarek was questioned by the authorities and had initially been unable to provide his whereabouts at the time of Ursula's disappearance. The following day, he told the authorities that he did in fact have an alibi. He claimed he'd been playing a board game specifically called Risk with his wife and their 2 friends inside their home. And when the authorities had carried out a search inside his home and workshop, they found no evidence initially linking him to the crime or to Ursula Herrmann at all. And just a few weeks after this, a closer examination of the box found in the woods led to the discovery of a fingerprint on a piece of duct tape. A huge group of local residents, including Werner Masarek, were brought in to provide fingerprints in order for them to compare with this sample that they found on this duct tape, but no matches were found. Despite having no evidence thus far to link him to the crime, authorities had arrested Masarek in January of 1982, just out of suspicion of his involvement as well as 2 of his close friends. The 3 men were interrogated for days after the arrest, but ultimately released after having made no breakthrough. And then in the following month, another known friend of Masarek's, a man named Klaus Pfaffinger, was brought in for questioning. This man was a trained mechanic but was currently unemployed and was known to have quite a drastic drinking problem. He owed a lot of money to his landlord from rental arrears, and this same landlord had also told the authorities that in the weeks before Ursula's disappearance, he saw his tenant on his moped holding a large spade. During the interrogation, Pfaffinger had initially maintained his innocence. But then on the second day, a breakthrough was made, when Pfaffinger was left alone with a police secretary. Believing that the interrogators were on a break, he had said to the secretary, "What if I know something?" And upon the return of the interrogators, he then told them that he was approached by Masarek in early September 1981, who'd asked him to dig a large hole in the forest in exchange for 1,000 Deutschmarks and a new colour TV as payment. Pfaffinger stated that he did as he was asked while completely unaware of what it was to be used for, and he later returned to find a large box having been placed inside the hole that he dug. In order to confirm the story, authorities had taken Pfaffinger to the forest and asked him to take them directly to the burial site, but he was unable to take them anywhere close to its location. And then when they returned him to the police station, he informed them that he was officially revoking his confession as none of it was true. They held him for further interrogations in the hopes of discovering that he did in fact have some involvement and was possibly protecting someone by withholding information, but he was eventually released with no charges. By the summer months of 1982, Masarek had made plans to move himself and his family away from Etching in an attempt to get away from all the negative attention and press that he was receiving. Around this same time, the lead detective in the investigation was replaced, and this detective had been the sort of main one who had chosen to focus these efforts specifically on Masarek. And so when the new lead detective had taken over, the search was reintroduced from a new angle and covering a wider group of suspects and theories. A re-examination of the woods and sort of a revisiting of the search led to the discovery that there had been a wire that had been strung up across trees through the forest that the investigators initially had believed was some sort of system put in place by the kidnappers themselves, either for directions through the forest or as a form of alert system. So this discovery in itself was a particularly interesting one, as it involved 2 students from the private school that shared its border with the forest. The 2 pupils had claimed that they'd been out in the forest chasing an owl around 7 or 8 months after Ursula's kidnapping, and they discovered this copper wire strung up between a number of trees. They were fascinated and decided to pull it down and take it back to their school grounds, where they laid it out, measuring it against the athletic pitch on the ground, before then putting it in a box and putting it away in their room. The investigators came to the conclusion that it was likely set up by the kidnappers in order for one to stand at one end and act as a lookout for any potential witnesses, possibly being attached to some form of bulb or buzzer at the other end to notify the other person who was located further in the woods. So by this point, everyone in Germany knew the name Ursula Herrmann, and her case was plastered over news outlets and television programs in the hopes of finding her kidnappers. And then an update occurred in the mid-2000s when Ursula Herrmann's case was found on a pile of old cold cases and revisited by some criminal investigators. Every piece of evidence that was stored from the original investigation, including the ransom note and the box itself, was re-examined thoroughly in the hopes of new DNA evidence being discovered 2 decades later. And this process ended up being successful, as they came across a number of hairs amongst the evidence which then could be tested to provide DNA profiles. The only thing they hadn't been able to find was matches for these DNA profiles, but then in 2007 this all changed. A piece of DNA evidence was specifically found on a screw on the box that Ursula Herrmann was found in, and this DNA profile matched one collected from a glass inside a penthouse in Munich, where a woman was murdered in 2006. So the victim's nephew at the time was on trial for the murder, and he would have been just a few years old at the time of Ursula's case occurring, so this DNA matching didn't really seem to provide any new leads in the case, any new avenues, so that was seemingly a dead end. A potential link between the two cases was examined thoroughly in the hopes of something being found, but the nephew ended up being convicted of the aunt's murder, and there was no evidence suggesting a link to Ursula Herrmann whatsoever. It does, however, remain a mystery how this DNA profile found on the box would match with one found in this woman's apartment, and whether there is actually a link or not. It is just worth considering, though, that DNA profiling is not always exact, and there are very rarely, but there are mistakes made. Despite all this time having passed since Ursula's death, investigators were still attempting to revisit the details of the case, all the while in a limited time frame. So they knew that because of the nature of this case being a kidnapping that led to the death of the victim, as opposed to it being a murder case, there was a 30-year statute of limitations. And so the investigators had just 5 years to find the perpetrators and convict them before there would be no legal means of receiving justice. By this point, Klaus Pfaffinger, who'd been the one who initially claimed to have dug the hole on behalf of Masarek, had since passed away. But Werner Masarek himself was still alive and still living in Germany. In 2007, he was placed under police surveillance, with an undercover police officer being sent in to become close acquaintances with him in the hopes of him learning something after getting close with him. There had even been a number of recording devices placed around his home, his car, and having tapped his personal phone as well, so they were convinced that he had something to hide. Later that same year, the investigators carried out a thorough search of Masarek's home and asked him to provide a saliva sample in order for it to be compared with the DNA profiles that they had on file, but he was found to not be a match to any of the genetic evidence found on the box. But then their attention turned to something that they discovered while inside Masarek's home during their search of his property. So they discovered an old tape recorder, and the investigators had thought back to the phone calls that the Herrmann family received from their daughter's kidnappers, during which the radio jingle was played. They brought in a sound expert who, after examining the tape recorder and the tapes of the 1981 phone calls, concluded that it had in fact been used to record the radio jingle and then play it down the phone to the Herrmann couple. And then on May 28, 2008, Werner Masarek was arrested and taken to a city near Esching to prepare for an upcoming trial. So by German law, the relatives of victims of certain types of crimes are given the opportunity to join the trial as co-plaintiffs, meaning they would have access to every piece of evidence that was being put forward in the trial and to be able to put forward questions themselves. And the Herrmann couple chose to not do so, purely because they didn't want to have to revisit all of the heartbreaking details of their daughter's death. But instead they asked their eldest son Michael, who was in his 40s at that point, and he agreed to be co-plaintiff. The trial of Werner Masarek began in February of 2009 and also saw Masarek's wife actually be put on trial as an accessory to the crime. The prosecution set out by painting a picture of Masarek's bad character through reports of certain incidents, and then started to describe all of the seemingly circumstantial evidence they had collected on him, namely the very likely motive of the crime being money. It was also stated that while he had been under police surveillance in 2007, his tapped phone had provided authorities with a recording of a phone call that he had shared with a friend from Esching, where they had started discussing the statute of limitations on Ursula's case. Pfaffinger's confession was also put forward by the prosecution, with them stating that despite him having revoked his claims, it was still allegedly a credible confession since it had been extremely accurate in the details provided regarding the burial site. And then there was the tape recorder. When Masarek was initially questioned regarding this item, he had told the investigators that he had only been in possession of it for a few weeks since he had purchased it at a flea market. But when all of these sellers of this market were allegedly contacted, none of them had been able to recall this item ever having been there in the first place. The sound expert had also testified, explaining that in the recordings of the phone calls, you can hear multiple clicking sounds, that when she pressed the actual recording and the start and stop button on the tape recorder that she had there, she said that the sounds of these buttons clicking proved to be an exact match as the ones that you can hear faintly in the phone call recordings. But Michael Herrmann himself, so Ursula's brother, had shared that he personally had a lot of doubt regarding the evidence that was put forward at the trial, namely the fact that the revoked confession by Pfaffinger was still being used as a credible form of evidence, and the lack of DNA evidence linking either Pfaffinger or Masarek. He also had a lot of doubt in their ability to prove that the tape recorder was specifically the one used to play this jingle in the phone calls. Michael had wanted to find his sister's killer, but according to him, he just couldn't ignore these concerns, and he spoke to his lawyer, who in turn told him that he should kind of ignore these doubts as it wasn't his place to start looking too much into it. But he chose to go against his lawyer's advice, and he wrote a letter to the court stating his belief that the sound expert had provided an incomplete or one-sided report of the evidence. This letter had not been received well by the judges, but by law they were required to read it aloud to the court. Masarek, in response to this letter, had sent his own letter to Michael, which contained wording that hadn't been gratitude for his honesty in doubting the evidence, but rather giving the suggestion that the two men were on the same side of a battle. By the end of the trial, the evidence had convinced the judges and the jury of Masarek's guilt, and he was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment, while his wife was actually acquitted of her accessory charge due to a lack of evidence. An interesting occurrence took place around 6 months into the trial of Masarek, when Michael Herrmann had noticed that he'd started hearing this high-pitched noise constantly in one of his ears. He claimed that the high-frequency sound would keep him awake at night and prevent him from working as he taught music for a living, and it was determined that he was likely experiencing this tinnitus as a result of the stress from the trial. And then in 2013, Michael filed a civil claim seeking 20,000 euros in damages from Masarek in exchange for him being the cause of his tinnitus. As it turns out, this had just been a part of an elaborate plan concocted by Michael Herrmann, as he was unhappy with how the trial ended and the evidence that they used to convict Masarek. He knew that if Masarek was to fight this civil claim case, which he likely would because the claim wasn't fair, the court would then be required to revisit the initial criminal trial in order to come to a final conclusion. It seemed that Michael Herrmann really did just want to seek out the truth behind his sister's death and would go to great lengths to uncover it. After the judges attempting to do everything they could to prevent this civil claim from going forward, it finally went ahead in 2016 and continued for over 2 years. And in this case, the focus of the media outlets at this point had been on Michael rather than Masarek. And as the trial moved ahead, it was soon very clear that Michael was not the only person who had doubts regarding the outcome of the initial criminal trial. An amateur sound expert had come forward after attempting to recreate the evidence of the phone call and the tape recorder that was testified by this initial sound expert. And this person in particular had concluded that it wasn't possible to replicate the findings, therefore placing great doubt in the testimony provided in the initial trial. So he wasn't saying that it was impossible that this was the specific tape recorder used in the phone calls, but he was more saying that it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to prove whether or not it was the tape recorder used. A linguistic profiling expert in London had compared the ransom notes with records of Masarek's handwriting and just pieces of writing that he'd written down, and found that the words and the style of writing and wording didn't match Masarek's. In 2018, the civil case ended with Masarek being required to pay Michael 7,000 euros for the tinnitus being caused during the trial. However, to Michael's dismay, this outcome meant that the court had to come to a final conclusion that Masarek was the individual responsible for Ursula's kidnapping and death. Michael has since been particularly open with his theories and beliefs regarding the details of his sister's case. He'd shared his belief that the copper wire found in the forest is something that could potentially provide some key details. There is also the belief that teenagers may have been involved in the case in some way, namely because on one of the ransom notes there had been a faint impression on the actual paper of a mathematical probability tree which is taught in schools at pupils in their teenage years. And Michael had since built on this idea of teenagers potentially being involved by saying that in one of the comic books that was found inside the box where Ursula was kept, one of the characters specifically drove a Fiat 600, the very same car that the kidnappers had instructed Ursula's father to drive while delivering the ransom money. They're just sort of theories, and like I said at the start of the video, I would really be interested in hearing your guys' thoughts in this one, because it's an absolutely huge case and there is so much doubt placed on the outcome that I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and if you've seen any interesting theories. So please do leave your discussions in the comments below. But that is where I'm going to end today's video, and I feel like it goes without saying that I genuinely do hope that one day some answers are found and that the person or the people responsible for Ursula's death can be put to some form of justice. So that is where I'm going to end things. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.